you're speaking, I'm going to find my script because that's disappeared. But let me begin by thanking everyone. It's been one of those nights where everything has gone astray. I'm going to let that stop us. My name is Ellie Marshalier. I'm a 32-year-old woman. I'm wearing a navy jacket. I have bright copper hair. And I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered, which is varied, of course, but I'm joining you from the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm going to throw over straight away to Matilda Alexander, who is CEO of QAI, to give us an overview of the A Right to Learn campaign, which is putting on tonight's webinar, and let us know where the campaign is up to. Matilda, over to you.
Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the country that we're coming from today. I'm on Turrbal Jagera lands, Meanjin as well. I'm a middle-aged woman with blonde and brown hair in a white and black shirt. Queensland Advocacy, and I'm the CEO of Queensland Advocacy for Inclusion. We are an advocacy and specialist community legal centre for people with disability, including the right to fighting for the right to an education for students with disability. We've got a young people's program that helps students with disability and their families to resolve problems and stay in school. We also provide legal help with disability discrimination and human rights things for school students. Disabled students are twice as likely to be suspended as their peers. If you're a kid with disability in Queensland, you've got a 1 in 4 chance of being suspended. And everything we've heard anecdotally this year says that this trend is getting worse, with more suspensions and more exclusions than the same time last year. This means that students with disability are losing days, weeks, months of their education. And this statistic gets worse for First Nation students with disability and kids in out-of-home care. This loss of education has a lifelong impact on these kids and an impact on every workplace that could have benefited from work and every community and family that's disadvantaged. 3 years ago, we partnered with ATSLS, YAC and Peak Care to call for an end to unfair suspensions. The A Right to Learn campaign wants to keep kids in school by making suspensions a measure of last resort, which was a recommendation of the Disability Royal Commission. Supports, including disability supports, should always come first. And this is a sentiment echoed by all good schools and teachers, but it's not yet law in Queensland. Last year, we commissioned an economic analysis of suspensions, finding keeping kids in schools is not just the right thing to do, it's the economically smart thing to do. We lose $41 million each year as kids with disability miss out on Year 12 because of suspensions. The cost to families is more than $14 million a year, or 76,000 missed work days due to providing additional care when kids aren't in school. Education is a right. Keeping students out of school does not benefit them, our schools, or our economy. Suspensions and exclusions don't work, but providing adjustments, care and support does. This is our second forum focused on what works. We know there are solutions and we will keep showing them. The high rates of repeated suspensions and exclusions for students with disability is evidence in itself that suspensions and exclusions do not work. Yet the more they're used, the more they're justified, resulting in a self-perpetuating and escalating spiral of failure. But this is not the failure of students with disability. It is the failure of us as a society that's letting these children down. If a doctor was seeing a patient who was getting sicker because of every treatment, the treatment would be reconsidered. We need to stop excluding students and start looking at what needs to change to keep them in school. These students are our literal future, and the educational path we provide for them today will be the road we walk on for decades to come. So we need you all to sign up to the campaign as supporters and stay engaged, taking action and turning up to make our schools make sure our schools are reflective of the world we as adults want to live in and play in. A world with people where people with and without disabilities live, work, and play side by side with equality and inclusion. Thank you for joining us today. Back to you, Ellie.
Thank you so much, Matilda. Um, I'm going to do the very interesting thing, which I'm going to come to you from my phone, which is always exciting when we're trying something new. But before we dive in, let me quickly cover some housekeeping. We've turned off all of your microphones, which helps us avoid background noise, but that absolutely doesn't mean we don't want your input. We want as many questions, comments, experiences shared throughout this webinar. So please use the chat function for any questions or thoughts. We'll get to as many as possible throughout this session. There's definitely a Q&A part of this session at the end. Just so you know, we're recording tonight. So if you duck out or want to share this with someone who couldn't make it, you'll have access to the full recording. Tonight is about hope, practical solutions, and collective action. Every single one of you being here represents a child whose educational journey could be transformed by what we discussed tonight. So now I get the extreme privilege of introducing our panel for tonight. I'm now we're so lucky to have a fantastic panel who are going to share their expertise and lived experience with us. First, we have Lindy from the Community Resource Unit Queensland's Inclusive Education team, who works directly with families to create inclusive environments where every child can thrive. Next, Paula from QAI's Education Advocacy team, who fights every day to ensure families know their rights and schools meet their obligations. And Brooke, a parent advocate who's walked this journey personally and is now helping other families navigate these challenging waters. Each of these amazing humans brings a different lens to this issue, and together they're going to give us the tools we need to create real change. So I'll welcome the panel. Welcome. Can I get you all to say hello and do a visual description of yourselves?
Shall I start, Ellie?
Absolutely.
So this is Lindy Brengman. I'm from the Community Resource Unit, the Families for Inclusive Education team. I'm joining you tonight from my home. I have red hair, I'm wearing glasses, and I'm a middle-aged looking woman.
Wonderful. And Brooke?
Hi, my name's Brooke. I'm a parent advocate. I've got two autistic children, aged 10 and 11. I am a mid-30s person with brown hair and I'm wearing a black shirt.
And Paula?
Hi, everybody. My name is Paula Holohan. I am the Senior Advocate here at QAI in the Young People's Program. And I am middle-aged with dark and silver hair, and I'm wearing a dark blue shirt with gold hearts on it.
Wonderful. All right, well, we're going to get straight into it. Let's start with you, Lindy. Can you briefly explain what inclusive education means in practice and why traditional suspension approaches often fail disabled students? An easy question to start off with, obviously. I've just a softball one.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Ellie. Yes, so I will be as brief as I feel I can be. So first of all, what does inclusive education mean in practice? Well, CREW and allies of CREW, who have been speaking about inclusive education for many years, believe it is all students belonging and being welcome together in school, in all places, in all activities. We talk about three parts to inclusive education. So first of all, physically being included, all students together at all times. social inclusion, so lunchtimes, school camps, extracurricular activities, and also high expectations and having curriculum inclusion for all students. So that's a very, very important piece as well. Everyone is supported and the adjustments are made so that everyone can actually fully access and participate in the classroom and in all school activities. We would also see if there is a school or classroom that actually where there's actually the practice of inclusive education, we should see 20% of students having a disability or diagnosis or needing adjustments being made. If there's not 20%, if there's less than that, it means that someone's being excluded. Someone is not being included there, and so we're not seeing inclusive education. We also see disability as being viewed as just a natural part of human diversity. Now, the second part of your questions around why traditional suspension approaches often fail disabled students. So there's a few reasons, and first of all, we would say that where sensory and movement differences of individual students are not respected, then children are really vulnerable to being punished for what is actually part of their disability. Traditional suspension approaches don't recognize that present in most human beings in our society, unconsciously, there is a bias against disability and against difference. And there's particular human differences that people don't have cognizance that they have biases against. And so if a school doesn't support staff to actually understand the way they think about the differences in the students in their class, then it's really likely that children with disability are going to be suspended, and maybe frequently. And then next, what's happening for many children with disability in schools is the reasonable adjustments aren't being provided that they're needing. And they do need them to actually feel comfortable and confident to go to school every day, to be comfortable in their environment, and to actually feel successful, feeling like they are supported to learn. So if these needs aren't met, and they're reacting. They're probably more likely to react, but they're not reacting to anything that I would say is any different to what would trigger us to react. And unfortunately, it means that, for example, a 6-year-old student who needs to have notice of change in order to feel control in their environment. They're feeling unconfident about coming to school. They struggle with handwriting, and they come to their class, and there's a supply teacher, and the first activity is handwriting, and the adjustment has not been provided, and there's big change, and the it's it's tipping them over the edge. And what we would say is actually, children with disability often are just expressing what's going on for them in the way that's available to them. So if this 6-year-old is unlucky enough to actually then throw something or push something over, then they're very vulnerable to being excluded. And then finally, when a child with disability is actually suspended, then what we're talking about in practice is the little people who are most vulnerable, like they're the most marginalized children in the school, and they're most vulnerable to being seen as different, as other, by the majority. And then the policy and the processes of schools are then pushing children out, suspending them, which is reinforcing to the community and to the other kids that these children aren't able to be related to, are really actually so other. And I think the biggest tragedy is these little people then see that in themselves. And they think that they have to be fixed or they have to change in order to be good enough to belong.
The cycle of ableism is so dangerous. Thank you for that, such a comprehensive answer. Now, Paula, I want to shift to the legal landscape. From an advocacy perspective, what rights do students and families have when schools are suspended? What legal rights do we actually have?
So good question, Ellie. In a nutshell, is really hinging on whether the school views the potential suspension as something that's, they don't call it a last resort, but it's to acknowledge the seriousness of implementing a suspension. So one of the first things that principals really need to keep in mind, and principals are the ones who are responsible for making the decision, they can delegate that the communication of the decision to somebody else in their team, but they are the ones who are making that decision. And they have to keep in mind some pieces of legislation such as the Disability Discrimination Act. They also have to keep in mind the Disability Standards for Education, the Human Rights Act, and I'm sure that Matilda and the legal people on this webinar can add in some more that might be applicable. But what they're doing really is looking at the situation. So there are some certain circumstances that suspensions can be implemented, and then they're looking at under what categories. Basically, they can say that someone has reached a certain level of issue, I suppose, and it could be that there's one of the categories is a danger to themselves or other young people or staff members in the community, in the school community. So the principal is to be looking at those types of reasonings or those standards for implementing a suspension, and then looking at whether a suspension is a suitable, I suppose you'd say, a suitable response to what's been happening. I guess the rights that students and families have are sitting under whether discrimination is taking place around disability, and also whether reasonable adjustments have been put in place for that young person. And that's sort of sitting underneath the Disability Standards for Education as well. So looking at what's been put in place, and also whether they've been collaborating with the families, the young person themselves, whether they've got everything in line and they've got everything set up, and even then these situations have been happening or an incident has been happening, which means that then they have to really think hard about whether a suspension is the right course of action. Suspensions are not meant to be handed out willy-nilly. I know that for us in the Young People's Program at QAI, we're obviously seeing when things are not going very well, because people generally don't contact us to tell us how great their school is, unfortunately. So we do hear about it when things aren't going well. And generally speaking, so just to keep in mind that just because a young person has a disability, under the policies of the department as well, that won't deter them from deciding to do a suspension. So we do have some parents who've called us and said, are they allowed to suspend my child? My child actually has a number of disabilities. Like what's the standing? Obviously, we can't give legal advice because we're not a legal service, but technically schools are able to suspend and exclude students with disabilities, which is obviously
And
what the Right
they
to Learn
are
campaign is.
Yeah, they are at a huge rate. Just
Mm.
quickly, if you can quickly answer this, our campaign is called A Right to Learn. Do students actually have a right to an education in Queensland? Is that a right that they have?
Under the Human Rights Act, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So there are a number of pieces of legislation that sort of coexist within the education space. But the principal still does have the decision-making power at the end of the day.
Right. Now, it's still so important for families to understand all of that. Brooke, I'd love to hear your perspective because, I'm a disability rights campaigner. I think lived experience is the best kind of expertise. Can you tell us about your journey and what led you to become a parent advocate in this space?
Oh, where do I start? Paula just gave me a bit of information about why one incident was a suspension and one wasn't. Now that's helped me clarify something actually, in terms of, those sort of legal parameters, which is good to know. So my children have always been in public education, and we started out at a different school than what we're at now. And we really struggled at that school. There was no active attempt to really be inclusive. They were ticking their boxes of, yes, we're doing these accommodations, but my children would just come home so anxious, so dysregulated. And I was constantly fighting for adjustments. They need sensory breaks, they need um, more one-on-one support, all of these sorts of things. And things just got worse and worse and worse until one day my son came home. At that time, he was grade 1. And he's sobbing, and finally sort of like was able to put words to it that a teacher at school was actually dragging him in the assembly hall. And it was because he was so overwhelmed by the noise and all of that that he wouldn't stand up and sing the anthem when they were expecting him to. It was a very rigid school. Um, and that he was so upset by this, but both he and his older sister thought that this was normal, like that they were allowed to do this. And so when I took it up with the school, they essentially investigated themselves and decided nothing had happened. And so then I went looking for other solutions. Obviously, at that point, I was like ready to homeschool because I was like, I'm not going to put my kids through this. This isn't okay. And eventually we found the school that we're in now, and the difference between the two was phenomenal. So this new school that we're at now, we've been there 4 years now. They have a very active inclusion process. Every classroom has a sensory corner. They have a sensory room for when they're really dysregulated. They don't get it perfect because feel like we're all, building this system at the moment. This is kind of new, right? Like it's not been done properly before. Um, but I think probably the main difference is they're willing to work with us. And so for the longest time, we've had like a lot of success, even through dysregulation. We've always walked back and forth with the school and, can we do this adjustment? Will this be practical? Maybe we can try this, back and forth with the therapists and with me and different teachers. And it's been really successful. And then things were going really, really well. And so I was like, okay, I can take my foot off the accelerator a little bit and sort of, the kids are a little bit older now. Maybe things are more under control. My son went to an excursion, none of the inclusion supports he needed. There was no preparation before he went. And because he'd been coping so well, they didn't realize he needed that. But he still needs that. That's why things have been going well. And all the wheels fell off, and he had a huge meltdown and ended up swearing at the inclusion support person at the time, who was escalating the situation and didn't know how to help him regulate in that moment. And I feel like she was panicking, he was panicking, everything escalated. And so, yeah, that whole process just really shocked us after working so hard. But biggest thing I learned is this was a different teacher, and I hadn't briefed her. I hadn't checked in. Things were all right, but you've kind of got to really stay on top of it, I think.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure on parents.
It is a lot.
Yeah, but it's a powerful story. Lindy, building on what Brooke shared, obviously the communication between families and schools is so important. In your experience, how can families and schools work together most effectively to prevent suspension situations from arising?
Yes, so something that we really work with families to develop is called a one-page profile, which many of you might have already heard of. And we have information on that. It's not a crew thing. It's been around for quite some time, but many parents find it really helpful because it captures who their child really is. So their strengths and their interests, and what they bring to the school as an individual. And then it's also a very handy tool to be able, and we encourage families to actually work this up with their child as well, as to what reasonable adjustments actually help. What helps them, what doesn't help them, what is likely to lead to situations where they're not feeling safe, comfortable, successful, and what they actually do need. And it's instead of it's going against the idea that we need lots and lots and lots of reports and things, very medical model on a child, and bringing it actually back to this is an individual child that, is a member of our family, and we know this is what works for them. This is their voice coming through, saying what works for them, and yeah, and hopefully it also is a very practical tool because it can go from one teacher to another. If you have a relief staff, if you have, excursions or whatever, like Brooke described, it can actually go from staff member to staff member, and it is hopefully a lovely, respectful way of representing the child.
Does have an example of one pager available?
Yes, we do. Yes. On our website, on our resource site, if you go to crew.org.au, you will find there's an inclusive education resource site, and you will find an example under the Working Collaboratively section.
Great. We'll send that out with the recording of this session because I think that's such a practical thing that people can do. Um, uh, uh, Paula, I know you touched on this in your first answer, but can you explain the legal obligations schools have the disability standards for education when it comes to making decisions around suspensions? Can you actually talk me through the actual practical process of making a decision around suspensions and what their legal obligations are?
Yes. So, first of all, um, just a little side note with ability to appeal a suspension. So, when suspensions are considered short suspensions, so they're from 1 to 10 days, they're not an appealable decision. So, that means that you can't submit an actual formal application for it to be appealed. But the suspensions that are 11 to 20 days are appealable. So, that's just a little side note, I guess you'd
And
call it.
I will note, I know that QAI has definitely been advocating that those suspensions between 1 and 10 days should be appealable.
Yes,
That's something that they've been advocating for strongly. 10 days is a lot of days that you can't appeal.
it is. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, there's some really good information on suspensions. There's a fact sheet on suspensions on the Department of Education website. So I really recommend people, if there's a suspension or there's talk of a suspension or there's a lot of reset days, what we hear about reset days, which are actually not official suspensions. They're just when the child gets sent home. So a parent may get a call to say, oh, your child is, not, this is what I've heard sometimes, the child is not participating in class. Could you please come and get them? Or, they're out in the garden and they're not coming back inside. Can you please come and get them? So there's lots of little things that happen where they may not be official, but they're still, students are still not able to access education because they're being sent home. So one of the first things, back to your original question, Ellie, sorry, I got sidetracked. The obligations around suspensions. So the principal really needs to think very carefully about why they're considering suspending a young person. So they have to take into account a few things. The Education General Provisions Act, the Disability Standards for Education Act, the Disability Discrimination Act, and also the Human Rights Act. So all of those things need to be, this is what the principal should be doing in the background before a decision has even been made. They need to look at whether a particular behavior or a particular incident is able to be identified as fitting in with those categories that I talked about earlier, that is a ground for suspension, is what they call a ground for suspension. They also need to ensure that they're giving the young person and their parent, guardian, whoever it might be, an opportunity to put across their point of view. So if it's a young person who's wanting to be involved in this process, that's really good. And often principals will ask the young person what happened. Sometimes they can do that without a support person, though, so that can be a bit fraught. And then they're meant to give them the opportunity to discuss. So that should be happening before a decision is even being made, that the principal is saying, you know, this has happened. We want you to come in and we want to talk to you about what happened. We want to get some information about your views and your point of view about what happened. So there's on this policy from the Department of Education, it's actually a flowchart, which I find really handy, because when you're being asked to come in, or when you're talking to the school about whether they're going to implement or whether they're going to start off the process of suspension, the flow chart actually steps it out, what needs to happen first, second, third. It's really good to print this out. It's really good to take this with you. So then you can look at that and say, I'm just seeing where we are up to in the process, because that sort of gives the principals a bit of knowledge that you know how this is meant to work. You know the steps, you know what's meant to be happening. So they're also meant to use that information after they've done the looking at all of the evidence. So that's also gathering evidence from other witnesses and things like that, other people who were involved, presenting that to parents, presenting that to the student, and then discussing it. So part of that is discussing what's happened, and that's an opportunity for the student and the parents to really put across your views about what's whatever incident is that they're talking about. Then they're meant to make the decision. So after this process, this whole thing that happens, then they make the decision. It's not meant to be, and this is something that does happen quite a bit, when parents will get a phone call. It will be, can you please come and get your child? They're now suspended. That's it. End of story. So under the obligations of those different pieces of legislation, plus the Department of Education's policies, they are meant to follow this flow chart, and they are meant to step through each section before they make a decision about whether they're going to suspend a young person.
Okay, I think that from the feedback I'm reading in the chat, this is not what's happening. So firstly, we will send out the flow chart with the recording after this event, so that people have that flow chart. Are you able to give that to me, Paula?
I sure can.
Okay, wonderful. I just want to acknowledge some comments in the chat. Melissa says she wishes the Right to Learn campaign would extend to New South Wales, as she lives in New South Wales. Her son, who's 6, has been suspended twice. She appealed and was rejected. She said her son's trauma and anxiety has only been amplified by suspensions. Can I suggest to you, Melissa, there's some wonderful disability advocacy organisations in New South Wales that I'm sure are working on school suspensions. If you go to the Department of Social Services website, they have a list of all disability advocacy organisations by state, and just to have a Google and go onto their websites, reach out to them, maybe send them a link to the Right to Learn campaign and suggest they should start one in their state. We wish we could help students everywhere, but our task is to make a change in Queensland. I've got more comments, but I find it really interesting that you've had 2 really different experiences at 2 state schools. I really want to hone in on what are the very specific practical differences between the schools that have had such a big difference for your children? Like, can you point to some practical things that have been done differently at your new school that have really made this a better experience, that maybe parents can implement at their own schools?
It all comes back to the like reasonable adjustments and advocating for what they are. I feel like schools won't instinctively work that out, and unfortunately, that leaves us parents, or if you've got therapists involved, or it leaves us doing the heavy lifting. But the biggest difference is the receptiveness to those reasonable adjustments was what I found. Um, the first school, just they were like, yeah, we can maybe look at that, or they just wouldn't even implement things at all. Just very rigid, that won't work in the classroom. Um, but yeah, at this school, they're open to it. I do find that you do have to do a lot of educating. So obviously every kid's different in terms of what their reasonable adjustments might look like. For my kids, both being autistic, the biggest one is like a lot of sensory regulation breaks. For my son, it's movement breaks. He can't just sit in the corner with some sensory toys. That's not going to work. He has to move his body. And if they expect him to sit for too long, then he's just going to get busier and busier and busier until we get really big movements, that potentially might upset kids near him or whatever. With those movement breaks in place, he can concentrate. All of his grades have improved since we've been able to do that because he can focus, he can concentrate in that time that he's sitting there. He gets his movement break and then he comes back and he can concentrate again. So it works in both ways. It benefits him and then it benefits the kids around him and it benefits his social relationships with the kids around him at the same time. Things as well, they'll provide like extra time. For my kids, that's not necessarily helpful, but I know that for some it really would be. And visual schedules and routine is a really big one, and prompts about change is massive. And so that's why the excursion went so wrong, because a whole bunch of changes happened really quick and he had no idea what was going on. In the classroom, because I've taken the time to explain it to his classroom teacher, she'll have the schedule written up. He knows what's going on. If something's going to change, she'll be like, okay, this is changing and this is what it's going to look like now. Do you need a minute for that? That processing time, allowing them, to be like, okay, yep, now I'm ready. Let's do the next thing. Those have been the biggest things.
They're pretty simple when you actually boil it down to practical things, but they make such a huge difference. Lindy, what I'm hearing time and time again is it's all down to the adjustments. If you make the right adjustments, kids can really thrive. But the school actually hearing out the experts, which is the students and the parents, seems to be the barrier. What have you found to be the best ways to get the adjustments you need actually implemented?
So obviously, families are thoroughly disempowered when it comes to a situation where you're actually trying to get across the importance of making these adjustments for your child, uh, even if it is not in line with a policy or procedure or process that the school wants to take. Um, all the families that I've ever seen be successful, there's some core things that they've done. One of them is, rather than try and tell the school how to do things or tell them, that it's the child's right or it's the law, etc., that they actually take total ownership of their authority as the parent, their love for their child, and representing their child and bringing their child's voice in. And uh, I mean, that can seem very airy-fairy, I suppose. But what I do see, and what Crew sees all the time, is just, telling schools how to do their job never works. Telling schools and staff what matters to you as a family, what matters to this little human being that you love, that's the most likely stuff to bring somebody along. And that's where that
So
one,
it's a messaging challenge.
it's totally the messaging.
So
Yep.
So if I was to approach a school and want to tell them, like, you need to allow Charlie to move about every hour or so, instead of telling them that, how would you phrase it?
I am concerned that Charlie is really struggling to feel comfortable at school. What I've known from being his parent for the last 7 years is he just needs to move all the time in order to actually concentrate. So I'm wondering, is there a way that we can talk about movement breaks, seeing what he's needing? Can we have a conversation about that? So that sort of eye language, trying to take the position as family, as you know, your authority as a family member, rather than telling them what you know they should be doing, if that makes sense.
Right. So coming at it about wanting to have a conversation rather than demanding an outcome from the beginning.
That's right. So formally called non-violent communication is what we're sort of using here. Yeah. Converse, like using words that will actually bring people closer to you rather than push them away.
Okay. Um, I'm seeing Paula, I'm seeing these stories, and look, I'm going to use some like interesting language because that's just what the stories include, and we're all adults here. Um, I'm seeing these stories. Julie in the chat has included one. She needs support because her grade 7 child was suspended for saying the word dick. Um, we've received stories at a right to learn of students being suspended for rolling their eyes at a teacher. Um, is this what suspensions are supposed to be used for? Is this legal?
I can't I can't give legal advice. But for my way of thinking, it's not particularly productive or it's not particularly helpful to be suspending for things that are A, could be very easily related to someone's disability, but also B, they just seem to be quite trivial for those for something for the response to be so severe, I suppose would be the word to use. Um, and I guess building on what Lindy was saying, building on what Brooke was saying, the relationships are the key thing. Even when we start, get involved and start advocating for schools, we're always talking about building that communication and building and trying to potentially repair some relationships. So we're trying to get to a stage where schools will actually be thinking differently about how they're responding to, behaviors that they might be concerned about or behaviors that they might go, oh, that's not,
How
ooh,
how
ooh.
would you how would you re-engage with a school that's suspending your child for rolling their eyes?
Um, Generally speaking, we would get in touch with them and just ask if we can be involved. Sometimes I don't ask. Sometimes I say I would like to be involved. That could be a question, but generally speaking, it's around let's see what we can do. Let's talk about this. Let's everyone get together. Do we need people from the regional office? Do we need other professionals to come in and really support this school to implement the reasonable adjustments that this young person needs? So it's not really about going in and saying you have to do this. It's more about let's all work together. This whole process is around everybody coming together to get a really good result for this young person and to make sure that we're doing the best we can. Everybody is working towards the same end, which is to have those reasonable adjustments in place for that young person so that they can thrive at school.
Melissa put a comment in the chat, which we know from the statistics. Well, it's backed up by the statistics. She says we are seeing 3-day suspensions most often, but some students get them every second week. The cumulative impact can they miss so much. We know students with disability get suspended multiple times at much higher rates. I just wonder, Lindy, obviously, when a student is being suspended over and over and over again, what's being done isn't working. And I'm not a parent, but in this conversation, I'm, I can, I feel a sense like there's a lot of pressure on parents to have all of the solutions and be the one like that has all of the answers, and that's a lot of pressure. What do you say to parents who actually, who can see that the behavior is coming from a place of their child's disability needs not being met, but they don't exactly know what the solution is? What do they do?
Yeah, and then it's also your child, and you're watching them get distressed and rejected over and over and over again. So it's a very emotional situation to suddenly try and be as logical as possible. Um, so uh, really articulating what is actually happening that's leading to the issue. Putting it in terms, like so reframing, putting it in terms of feelings and emotions, and triggers rather than and trying to sort of work towards solutions. It is a really, really difficult situation. I have seen families, Crew has seen many families turn things around, but it takes a lot of patience and a lot of I think many families need to know their bottom line as well as to when is it time to call it and try a different school or a different situation because it can be very traumatizing. And each time that the suspension happens, then you also have a child who's actually a bit more anxious, a bit more likely to be on edge, more likely to be triggered, more like, so it becomes very, very difficult for the whole family. Yeah. But I think the more that you can do to actually appeal to the good nature of human beings, and I do believe that most principals and most school staff went into the job because they genuinely care about children and can relate um, parent to parent or to the children and their experience. I think the more that you can do that, the better.
All right, Paula, we've got so many questions coming through the chat. I love an engaged chat, so thank you so much. We've got a question from Melanie who said, how long should the decision-making process take? There's mixed messages for some students when the consequence is a long time after the incident.
It's phrased as being a reasonable amount of time. So if there is a really long time between the incident and a decision being made, then if it's a short suspension, while that's not appealable, you can still put it to the school that they're not necessarily following the procedures under the Department of Education's procedure and policy. So it is tricky because sometimes there is a bit of I won't say leeway because that's not what it is, but it's more that principals they have a lot of power. So it may be that they're not necessarily doing things the way by the book. They're not necessarily doing things strictly following the processes that the department sets out. Um, so yeah, it is a bit of a grey area because there isn't actually a time frame listed of, once an incident has happened, the principal needs to have made a decision by this time, which can make it very frustrating and very confusing for what do people do? What are they going to do? It's also very confusing for the young person because as far as they're concerned, that happened ages ago. And do they remember? Do they remember the incident? Do they remember what happened? Using a punishment or suspensions are a punishment as far as I'm concerned. And so using that a long time after the actual incident is really not going to get the results that they want. If the school is feeling that they're doing this disciplinary action a long time after an incident, it's not really going to give them what they are hoping for anyway, I don't think. No, not in my experience, certainly.
Okay, now I appreciate it's 7 o'clock, but we did start a bit late, so I'm going to make the executive decision that we're going to go 10 minutes over. If you do have to jump off, I totally understand. It is being recorded, so you can come back and watch. But we've got so many great questions coming in from the audience. I want to address a few of them. Lindy, Paula has given us some really great understanding of what our rights are and what should be happening. But in a practical way, how can parents best hold schools accountable? And this is a question from Paula. Hold schools accountable and enforce what schools are supposed to be doing. What can parents, do you have suggestions about what parents should reference? You know, what should they have in their folder when they go into schools? Like, how best enforce kids' rights?
So thanks, Ellie, for that question, because we actually do a whole day workshop on this very topic. And
I need you to just answer it in 2 minutes.
So first of all, we would always say that it's the heart of advocacy that will always bring people along. But to have in your back pocket, understanding the research behind what you're asking for, having a good understanding of the human right to inclusive education, and what it actually is, and why it's a human right. And the legislation, so the Disability Standards for Education, it does not hurt to start bringing in the words. So, reasonable adjustments so that my child can participate on the same basis as other children. Those sorts of words tend to trigger a bit of a response in people without hopefully getting them offside. So, that's some suggestions. And then being connected with other families. So this is a good example, but being connected with other families who are advocating for inclusive education, to know what strategies and things are they getting in their schools, and then be strategic with how you actually ask for those, and also being clear on what other resources. So within the Department of Education, there are principal advisors for inclusion, for autism, for restrictive practices, actually encouraging the school to look outside their premises and getting expertise in from within the department, things like that.
Angela asked, are public schools monitored on their suspensions for students with disabilities? And I can answer that one as someone who's worked on the Right to Learn campaign. They are monitored on their suspensions of students with disability. Do they make that information public? No, they make it very difficult. We've had to put in right to information requests in order to get that information, in order to have the statistics we do. But we are developing, trying to work with the Department of Education to make that more transparent. And we hope, we keep the campaign that to be more publicly available, because you can't action anything that isn't measured and isn't out there to be made accountable. So that data is really important, and as a campaign we're always aware that we need the freshest data, so it's something we're aware of. They are monitored for suspensions of students with disability, so we are always wanting to get that information. I just want to read some comments. There's people talking about the lack of training in schools. It's such an effect on inclusive education. There was a comment about the importance of knowing your child's rights, advocating for them, keeping good communications with the school, and being patient and persevering. Someone said schools are pushing back on reasonable adjustments and responding by pushing the child out of school. That's the last thing we want. We have another comment that there are also some enormous hurdles for non-verbal students in mainstream schools because staff don't have enough training in communication strategies, AAC, or facilitated communication. So that's a cohort that's particularly, well, they're not vulnerable, they're made vulnerable by systems that don't work. I'm seeing more questions come in, and we're not going to get to all of them, but I might summarize them in the email and get as much information as I can to people. I just want to thank everyone in the audience for being so engaged. I'm going to ask everyone on our panel to end on a 30-second answer, which is to the question, if parents are to, or people in the audience to take one thing away with them tonight, what would you want them to take away?
So for me, what I would say is that everyone needs to be curious, to constantly seek to understand the other, and do believe, like, have high expectations for other human beings, in their capacity to actually change mindset.
All right, that's great. Brooke?
I would say just try and listen to your instincts. You know your child better than anybody. And I found myself second guessing, oh, am I asking for too much? You're not. You're not at all. And just keep advocating one thing at a time. It's a slow process.
Yeah. Yes, and Paula?
I think my one thing, oh, just one, I think one thing would just be to don't lose hope. That, to keep working with the school as much as you can. And yeah, definitely, as Lindy was saying, and as Brooke was saying, we're saying that you know, communication is key with schools and keeping those relationships flowing and those relationships and that open-mindedness, as Lindy was saying, that open-mindedness and that curiosity about what can be done and what can be put in place.
Wonderful. Well, as we wrap up tonight, I want to leave you with this. Every conversation we've had tonight, every strategy we've shared, every right we've outlined, none of it means anything unless we act on it. Here's what I'm asking each of you to do before you close your laptop tonight. Take one thing you've learned tonight and commit to using it, whether that's having a conversation with your child's school, reaching out for advocacy support, or simply changing how you think about challenging behaviors. And secondly, and this is critical, I want you to think of one person who needs to hear what we've discussed tonight. Maybe it's another parent struggling with school issues, an educator in your life, or a friend who works in disability services. When you get an email from us, send them this link. Get them to join our campaign. Because here's the truth. We changed the system one conversation, one family, one school at a time. Every person who joins this movement multiplies our impact. The right to campaign is just about policy change, about cultural change. And that starts with each of us becoming advocates in our own communities. Thank you to our incredible panelists, Lindy, Paula, and Brooke. Thank you to Matilda. And thank you to every single one of you for showing up tonight, even though there were technical difficulties. Together, we're building a world where every child's right to learn is protected and celebrated. Keep fighting the good fight, and we'll see you in this movement. Good night, everybody.